Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Happy New Year's Eve. Today's video, I'm going to be telling you all the books I read this year, a total of 121. I'm going to be showing you all 121 books that I read this year. I don't have copies of every single one, so I'll just tell you the name. And then along with every single book, I'm going to show you the author and the rating that I gave it. If I didn't finish it, I'll just let you know that I didn't finish it. And that's really it. I'm going to start off with the month of January when I read 3,192 pages and 13 books. The first book I read in 2018 and the month of January is The Name of the Star by Maureen Johnson. I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. The next book I read is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. And then I read the autobiography of Joseph Stalin by Richard Lowry, which I DNF'd after reading 37 pages just because it was not exactly what I thought it was going to be. Then I read Her Mother's Hope by Francine Rivers, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read the graphic novel Through the Woods by Emily Carroll, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next book that I read is the sequel to Her Mother's Hope, which is Her Daughter's Dream by Francine Rivers, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Then I started Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf and did not finish it after page 27 because I got distracted by other books. Then I read The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read One by Sarah Crossan, which I gave 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next book I read was Courage Has No Color by Tanya Lee Stone, and I gave that 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read the graphic novel This One Summer by Mariko Tamaki, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. And then I read Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. The last book I read is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The month of February was not so successful as the month of January for me. I read 950 pages and 8 books. First book I tried for the month of February was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I got 16 pages into it before I DNF'd it because I simply did not have the time, as I had a full-time job, to read the entire work of this novel. Next book I read was Florence Nightingale, The Courageous Life of a Legendary Nurse by Catherine Reef. I got 18 pages into it before I DNF'd that one also because I didn't like the way it was writing her biography. It wasn't what I wanted to read at all. I did actually finish this next book, Harriet Tubman, Freedom Bound by Janet Benge and Jeff Benge. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Emma by Jane Austen and got 400 pages into it before I DNF'd the crap out of this thing. Then I read High Society by Ally Carter, which I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Then I started A Secret Gift by Ted Koepp, and I DNF'd it to 22 pages into it because this was simply not the time to read it. As I said, I had a full-time job at this point. Last book I read in February was The Horse and His Boy by C.S. Lewis, which I gave 2.5 out of 5 stars. In the month of March, I read 4 books and 872 pages. I read Claire Barron, Courage Under Fire by Janet and Jeff Benge, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And then I read The Raven Girl by Audrey Zephyr, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read Out of My Mind by Sharon M. Draper and gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Raven Boys by Mackie Stiefvater, and I got 173 pages into it before I DNF'd it. I know a lot of people like this book, but I just wasn't into the whole fantasy and supernatural element of it. I wanted to get into some contemporary stories, so that's why I put this one down. In the month of April, I read 873 pages and 6 books. This one is kind of embarrassing. I'm not even sure if it should be on my list, but I read Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, but I only got 5 pages into it before I DNF'd it. Then I read David Livingstone, Africa's Trailblazer by Janet and Jeff Benge, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad for School, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And then I read Mary Slessor, Forward into Calabar by Janet and Jeff Benge, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next was Fancy Pants by Kathy Marie Hake, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I started C.T. Stud No Retreat by Janet and Jeff Benge. I got 40 pages into it before I DNF'd it. I was reading it for school, and by the time I got to 40 pages, it was too late, so I just put it down because I was bored. By the month of May, my seasonal job was over and I didn't have any more school, so I read 15 books and 2,891 pages. First book I read is Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. But then I read Catching Fire by Suzanne Collins, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins, and I gave it also 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read the graphic novel by Marissa Meyer of Wires and Nerve, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And then I read We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, something like that, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I reread Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Golden Daughter by Anne Elizabeth Stengel. I got 72 pages into it before I DNF'd it because I realized I was not in the mood for a fantasy novel. I wanted to read more contemporary. The rest of the books on here are actually just graphic novels and comic books, so get ready for a buttload of those. First is Here Comes Daredevil Volume 1 by Mark Waid. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And then I read Quiet Girl in a Noisy World by Debbie Tung, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Gettysburg, a graphic novel by C.M. Butzer, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Here Comes Daredevil Volume 2 by Mark Waid, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next 3 and the last 3 books are the Miss Marvel comics, No Normal, Generation Y, and Crushed by Alphona Wyatt, and I gave them all 3 out of 5 stars. In the month of June, I read 3,395 pages and 10 books. First book I read is On Writing by Stephen King, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Next, I started What Alice Forgot by Liane Moriarty, and I DNF'd it after 143 pages. I was taking a while to get through it, and by the time that I reached 143 pages, I had already started another book, finished it, found it very similar but better to What Alice Forgot, and figured there was no point in finishing it after such a grueling start, so I just put it down. Then I read Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Little Do We Know by Tamara Ireland Stone, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. In hindsight, I would give it closer to a 3 out of 5 stars. Then I reread Quiet Girl in a Noisy World, An Introvert Story by Debbie Tung, and I gave it again 5 out of 5 stars. Again started Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and by the end of it I loved it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And then I read the graphic novel Fantastic Four Imaginauts by Mark Waid, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Works and Days by Hesiod, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Then I started Milk by Mark Kurlansky, and I got 13 pages into it before I DNF'd it because it was way too boring and slow. Then I read Need by Joel Shabanu, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. In the month of July, I read 2,768 pages and 12 books. It was also the month that I participated in the Booktubeathon. I read The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants by Anne Brochars, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Verdi by Janelle Cannon, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Ancient Greece, From Prehistoric to Hellenistic Times by Thomas R. Martin, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Enuma Elish, translated by Timothy J. Stefani, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I read The Epic of Gilgamesh, a Penguin Classic, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Dancing Master by Julie Clausen, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Oedipus Rex, which I gave 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read Since You've Been Gone by Morgan Matson, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. And then Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban by J.K. Rowling, which I also gave 4 out of 5 stars. And then A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Backman, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. And then I read In Case We're Separated by Alice Madison, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then the last book that I read is The Lost Hero by Rick Riordan, and I gave it 4.2 out of 5 stars. In the month of August, I read 3,354 pages and 11 books. First book I read is Wicked by Gregory Maguire, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Save the Date by Morgan Matson, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read None Like Him by Jen Wilkin, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read The Unexpected Everything by Morgan Matson, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read the comic book Black Panther Volume 1 by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And I read My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Fredrik Backman, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And I read Amy and Roger's Epic Detour by Morgan Matson, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And I read the comic book Spinning by Tilly Walden, which I gave 3 out of 5 stars. The last one is Kerbet Kazeb by S. Yazar, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. In the month of September, I read 1,854 pages and 9 books. Start of the month of September, I finished the Chronicles of Narnia series, reading The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I DNF'd after 54 pages because I realized that this is not a book that you should read in LA, and I was in LA at the time. Next, I went on to The Hobbit, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Piecing Me Together by Renee Watson, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Iliad of Homer, and I DNF'd it after 97 pages because I was not going through it fast enough for my school. Then I started and finished The Son of Neptune by Rick Riordan, and I gave it 4.2 out of 5 stars. Then I reread Ancient Greece from Prehistoric to Hellenistic Times by Thomas R. Martin, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Ferris' Son by Hannah Williams, or H.S.J. Williams, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. In October, I read 4,077 pages and 9 books. The first book that I read in the month of October is One Day in the Life of Anne Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read 10 Years in the Tub by Nick Hornby, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Mark of Athena by Rick Riordan, and I gave it 4.3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Theater of War by Brian Dories, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Odyssey, the graphic novel, which I don't have to represent here, but I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I reread Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling, and I gave it 4.7 out of 5 stars. Then I reread Athlin Mara by J.M. Burroughs, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read The House of Hades by Rick Riordan, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. In the month of November, I read 14 books and 3,739 pages. In the month of November, I read The Blood of Olympus by Rick Riordan, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And I read the graphic novel Wires and Nerve Volume 2 by Marissa Meyer, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Agamemnon by Aeschylus, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read A Quiet Kind of Thunder by Sarah Bernard, and I gave it 4.4 out of 5 stars. Then I read A History of the Ancient Near East by Van de Marup, and I read 30 pages before I DNF'd it. Next, I read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renee Edo-Lodge, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Do Hard Things by Alex and Brett Harris, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I started The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stefan Chbosky, and I read 39 pages before I DNF'd it because it was not something I was into reading. Then I read What I Lost by Alexandra Ballard, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Under Rose-Tainted Skies by Louise Gornal, and I gave it 3.3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Definitions of Indefinable Things by Whitney Taylor, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. The last book I read in the month of November is Paperweight by Meg Haston, and I gave it 3.45 out of 5 stars. And in the last month of the year, December, I read 3,082 pages and 10 books. I started off the month with Every Last Word by Tamara Ireland Stone, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I started Made You Up by Francesca Zappia, and I got 197 pages into it before I DNF'd it because I found it inaccurate, boring, and not the genre I wanted to read. Then I read Prometheus Bound by Aeschylus, and I gave it 3.2 out of 5 stars. Then I started A Tragic Kind of Wonderful by Eric Lindstrom, and I got 81 pages into it before I DNF'd it because it was not what I wanted to be reading at the time. The Naked Lady Who Stood on Her Head, A Psychiatrist's Most Bizarre Cases by Gary Small, and I gave it 3.7 out of 5 stars. Then I read A Quiet Girl in a Noisy World by Debbie Tung for a third time this year, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix by J.K. Rowling, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince by J.K. Rowling, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then I decided to pick up and reread Loving vs. Virginia by Patricia Huby Powell, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The last book that I read in December and the year of 2018 is Mrs. Dalloway. I picked this book back up from January to finish it, and I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Those are all of the books I'm reading this year. Later today, I'm coming out with another video explaining some, like, my top 3 favorite books, my least 3 favorite books, some other statistic things, some of my other favorite things. That's all I have for now. I wish you all a good 2019, and I hope you had a great 2018. I'll see you guys later. Bye.